Welcome, friend. Follow me. We're going somewhere dark, somewhere dangerous. Most people would never dare enter the place we are going. There's no telling what horrors we'll find, what terrors we'll uncover. Don't say I didn't warn you. We might discover terrible monsters lurking there. Be careful, they could follow you out, or maybe they're already inside you. Are you afraid? Good. Now you are ready to enter the Warning Woods. Chris Gilbert carried the groceries in from his car just after 5:30 on the evening of July 3rd. "Russell," he called into the house as he dragged his 2 heavy bags through the living room toward the kitchen. A small clinking preceded tiny feet clacking up the adjacent hallway. Chris and the 3-year-old Yorkie Russell reached the kitchen at the same time. "There you are, boy. Why didn't you come see me when I walked in? Have you been taking a little nap? Oh, yes, you have. I can see your fur all smashed on that side. You need to go out?" Russell's tail wagged and his head cocked to the right. "All right, let me just set these down." Chris set his grocery bags in front of the pantry and rubbed his sore hands on his work pants. On his way to the back door, he took a big whiff of the crock-pot chili his boyfriend Aurelio prepared before leaving for work. Aurelio would be home in roughly an hour, and Chris couldn't wait to eat. He was starving, and the spicy aroma wasn't helping. He led Russell to his leash outside, which tied to a stake twisted into the grass. He and Aurelio first moved in with no intention of getting a dog, so the fact that their new backyard wasn't fenced in hadn't mattered. Since adopting Russell, they'd entreated their landlord to install a fence and even offered to pay for it so they wouldn't need to tie Russell up every time he went out. The landlord, likely out of laziness, Chris thought, said no. They planned on moving somewhere more pet-friendly when their lease ended the next year. They also wanted to move further away from the woods. From their backyard, Chris could see the skyscraping trees of the TEUFELSSPIEGEL woods behind the rooftops of the next few houses. German immigrants who settled in that area hundreds of years prior gave the woods the name Teufelsspiegel, which means Devil's Mirror. According to legend, the native tribes warned the settlers about creatures in the woods that could perfectly mimic any other living thing. These creatures apparently liked to take the form of a trusted person and infiltrate nearby groups of people, using their disguises to get close enough to strike. It's said if you stand at the edge of the woods, you might see yourself looking back at you from amongst the trees. Although he didn't believe the legend, Chris still hated living so close to the woods. He knew predators could fly or wander out of there at basically any time, which made leaving little Russell outside unaccompanied more stressful than it needed to be. Recently, he watched a hawk circle over their yard after spotting Russell tied up and helpless in the grass. For these reasons, Chris always kept an eye on Russell whenever the dog went outside. He liked to sit out on one of the patio chairs when he could, but every Thursday, he did the grocery shopping, and the groceries needed to be put away before the frozen foods thawed. Because of the hawk incident, that Thursday, Chris intended to only put away what necessitated colder temperatures before going outside. After he ducked into the freezer to move aside the remainder of last week's ice cream, he peeked out the kitchen window to check on Russell. At first, he thought the dog had lain down behind the small fire pit Aurelio built the previous fall, because he could see his leash but no Russell. He closed the fridge and stepped up to the window, leaning over the sink for the best view. He saw the shiny clasp at the end of the leash lying in the grass directly beside the fire pit, Russell's collar lying chained to it. Russell was nowhere in sight. Chris ran outside, calling Russell's name before he even stepped through the door. He heard the dog's playful yip on the other side of his rear neighbor's fence. Apparently, his dog had scrambled under the fence somewhere and became trapped in that yard. Chris breathed a sigh of relief. This was probably the best-case scenario. Chris walked around the side of his neighbor's house, up to the front door, and knocked. Iris Holbrook, the 62-year-old woman who lived there alone, answered the door a couple of minutes later. "You here for that yippy dog of yours?" Iris asked. She smiled and gestured for Chris to enter her home before he answered. Her voice held no irritation. She loved Russell so much, Chris half expected her to have let the dog inside after she found him in the backyard. However, she led Chris to her back door and opened it to let him into the yard. Iris said, "I heard his little barks and thought, oh, it's finally happened. That little dog found the hole in my fence. How'd he get off his leash?" Looking side to side and growing concerned, Chris answered, I'm not sure yet. Hey, where did you see him last?" Russell was no longer in the yard. Iris gasped. "I'm so sorry. Oh no, he must have climbed back through the hole. See it over there on the west side? Some raccoon dug underneath the fence last year, and gosh darn it, I just never remember to fix it. Oh, Chris, you'd better hurry in case he runs toward the woods." "I'll find him. Thanks anyway, Iris. Your fence slowed him down at least." Iris walked him back through the house. As they passed by her front window, she grabbed his elbow and pointed. "No, no," she gasped. Chris saw him too. Russell had crossed the street again and was now trotting between the last two houses before the open prairie separating the neighborhood from the TEUFELSSPIEGEL woods. Chris said, "I gotta," but Iris's voice overtook his. "Hurry before he gets to the woods. Run, Chris, run. If he goes in there, oh, you'd better not follow him. If he gets into those trees, you'll never know whether it's your dog you're seeing or something else. Please trust me, I've lived here a long time. The legend is true. Yeah, no, it's not something to second guess." "Yeah, I know. Thanks for the warning," Chris replied. He hurried out the door. He lost Russell to the prairie behind the houses across the street. He tried calling Russell's name as he ran, but the dog wasn't yipping anymore. Chris didn't like how dead set Russell seemed on getting to the woods. Why would he want to go there anyway? Certainly everyone's trash cans and grills must have held better sense for him to pursue. Why would Russell waste his taste of freedom on some creaky old woods? Chris had always respected the local legend by never venturing into the TEUFELSSPIEGEL woods, but he didn't believe it. His reason for wanting to catch Russell before he reached the woods was the same reason he always feared for the dog's safety. The Yorkie wasn't much bigger than a squirrel and not nearly as fast. He would make an easy meal for basically anything that wanted a bite of him. Chris waded through the untouched prairie between the neighborhood and the woods. A gentle but constant wind made the grasses whisper and hiss incessantly. He felt grateful Iowa didn't have many venomous snakes sneaking through its grasses. There was no way he would have been able to hear or see one before stepping on it. Although, he worried, a big enough snake would not require venom to take Russell down. He called the dog's name a few more times but received not one yip or growl in response. He wished the dog hadn't shed his collar in his escape. Maybe his clinking tags would have made him easier to track. Finally reaching the opposite end of the prairie, Chris emerged. His left leg was covered in burrs which he picked at while scanning the trees for his little dog. He suddenly felt nervous about yelling out, as if his subconscious did not want the woods to know he was there. The wind brought in a column of puffy clouds that now began to obstruct the evening sun. Chris actually felt grateful for this development as he didn't need to squint anymore when peering through the trees, and it was still plenty bright enough for him to see. Not that seeing helped him any. There was still no sign of Russell in any direction. Without another option, Chris walked into the woods. After a quarter of an hour of searching through the trees, looking in hollow trunks and behind bushes, he was beginning to realize the futility of his search. The whispering of the prairie was far behind him, but had been replaced by the whispers of the trees above. For a moment, the wind died down enough for the leaves to go still. Chris paused to utilize this gift of silence and listen. Further ahead, and slightly to his right, Chris heard the movements of a small animal across the ground. He started moving so quickly toward the sound he nearly tripped over a small log. The woods had an oppressive quality that made him feel nervous about making any sound at all. He kept his voice low, but called Russell's name. This single sound felt like a sin. He picked up his pace rather than repeat it. Even though the wind picked up again, now that he was moving closer to Russell, Chris could still hear his pattering footsteps. He followed the small gorge that might have been a creek bed in another time. As he ascended the opposite grade, just as his head breached the top, his eyes met Russell's about a dozen yards ahead. "Hey, boy," Chris enthusiastically whispered. "Come here, come to Daddy. Let's get home, huh?" The dog took a small step toward him, making a sound not quite a whimper, but definitely not the excited yip Chris had expected. "Come to me, boy," Chris whispered. He slowly crawled up the rest of the grade. At the top, he held out his empty hands, showing the dog he meant no harm. Why was he being so wary all of a sudden? Russell never shied away from his beloved owners. Chris nearly fell back down the gorge when his phone suddenly rang in his pocket. He picked it up, saw Aurelio's name and face, then noticed the time. Aurelio had probably just gotten home and was wondering where he and Russell were. "Hey, where are you? You left all the groceries out and the freezer's cracked open," Aurelio said right when Chris answered. Chris wiped sweat from his forehead. "Sorry, I should have texted you. Russell ran off, so I had to go after him." The moment his name was spoken, it seemed Russell panicked. He tore off deeper into the woods, running faster through brush and brambles than Chris had ever seen him run in open grass or pavement. "Well, I've got good news," Aurelio said. "I saw him running around the neighborhood when I was driving home. He came right to me when I stopped. We're both home now." Wait, Chris replied. Are you actually with him right now? Like at this very second, can you see him?" "Yep, he's right here, sitting on my lap. We're watching Breaking Points in bed." When Chris didn't say anything, Aurelio asked, "Could he have gotten away from you and circled back here? Where are you anyway?" "The woods," Chris replied. Silence inserted itself between them. "Hey, Chris?" Aurelio said. Chris knew what he was going to ask. Before the question got verbalized, he said, "It has to be him. I followed him all the way from our house." Aurelio sighed. "I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I believe you, but you should come back, okay? It's getting late, and not that I believe what people say, but those woods creep me out. I don't like you being out there alone." "Me either," Chris replied. "But I just don't get it. How can Russell be with you? I just saw him like a second ago. He was right in front of me." "In front of you in the woods?" Aurelio asked, not needing to say any more. Chris sighed, although it came out like a growl. "All right. I don't get what's happening at all right now, but if you swear you have our dog," Aurelio said. "He's here. I'll see you soon." "And you're sure it's him?" "Yes, I'm sure. Now hurry back." Aurelio hung up. Chris took a few steps forward to see if he could locate Russell or whatever he'd followed into the woods one more time. He wanted to study the dog, to see if he could notice anything about it which would definitively prove it wasn't really his pet. But he couldn't find Russell up ahead. He'd run too fast. That was it. Russell had run too fast. Chris had never seen him move that way, not really. Had he? He tried to remember but couldn't. Then he thought about Aurelio at home with Russell curled up on his lap. Did he think his boyfriend wouldn't know if it was really their dog he was holding? Petting? The behavior of the Russell Chris followed had seemed odd, he supposed. Not impossible or unbelievable, but strange nonetheless. Strange offered little comfort, though. After rigorous debate, Chris made the difficult choice to turn around and head back home. He encouraged himself with the prospect of holding his beloved Russell again soon. He wasn't sure what he would do about the thing that had tricked him into the woods, since he'd been forced to decide that's what happened. But that was a problem he was sure he and Aurelio could work through together. "Any luck?" Iris asked as he walked by her fence on his way home. Apparently Aurelio has him at home," Chris answered, intentionally omitting any more detail about what happened. "Well, that's a relief," Iris replied. "I was afraid you'd gone into the woods looking for him. I lost you after you went into the prairie." Chris was about to admit to having gone into the woods, but realized that would be a bad choice around someone as superstitious as Iris Holbrook. I can't wait to see him, Chris finished instead, forcing an exuberant smile. I'll bet, said Iris. She waved farewell and turned to walk back into her home. Chris reached his front door 2 minutes later. He'd left it unlocked, but apparently Aurelio locked it after coming home, and Chris didn't have his keys. He knocked, but didn't hear anyone move inside. Figuring Aurelio probably had his volume too high in the back bedroom, Chris rang the doorbell, then knocked again. Aurelio, it's me. I'm back, Chris called through the door. Still, no one answered him. Maybe he got in the shower or something, Chris thought. No matter. He went to the garage and punched in the code. Once the door rose high enough, he ducked underneath. There was Aurelio's car, right where he always parked, which Chris had to admit made him feel a little relieved. He'd been harboring a whispering doubt that the voice he'd heard on the phone had not actually been Aurelio at all. The couple almost always left the door from the garage to the house unlocked, and that evening was no exception. Chris used it to gain entry without issue. Russell, Chris called as soon as he was inside. Russell, come here, boy. I was looking all over for you. He heard Russell's tags clinking somewhere down the hallway, but the dog didn't come to him. Chris rolled his eyes and, as he slipped off his shoes, asked, Hey Aurelio, didn't you hear me at the door? Too lost in the news to let me in, huh? His playful tone disguised a rising dread swelling at the base of his throat. Everything felt off. His house didn't even smell right. He detected a muddy, earthy aroma buried underneath the smell of Aurelio's chili. It wasn't necessarily a bad smell, but certainly out of place. Aurelio? Chris called down the hallway. He could see a sliver into the bedroom, just enough to view Aurelio's right arm at the edge of the bed. Chris stormed toward him, his anxiety turning to anger. This isn't funny. I've been out there. He stopped when he reached the bedroom doorway. Aurelio was lying on the bed, not watching his news show as he'd claimed. He was staring blankly up at the ceiling. Worse, Russell was not in his lap, as he'd claimed on the phone. What's going on? Chris said, less as a question than an accusation. Where's Russell? Aurelio's blank stare dragged across the ceiling, then down the wall until their eyes met. He slowly turned his head away from Chris, then looked down at a wad of blankets at his left side. Chris saw Aurelio's left arm was hidden beneath the wad, which was just about the right size to also hide a little Yorkie. If this is a game I'm not playing, Chris said, I've been through a lot already this evening and I don't have it in me to... Russell's tags clinked beneath the blanket. Aurelio, with a slight smile, nodded toward the sound, inviting Chris to take a look. Chris was no fool. He recognized something off about his partner, and Russell would never hide under a blanket. He was much too fearful. He would start barking the second either of them ever tried to cover his face. Chris started to back out of the room. At the doorway, his back bumped into something soft and warm. He spun around and found himself face to face with himself. He was even wearing the same clothes. Something intangible in his eyes looked unfamiliar, but Chris supposed he had never looked into a mirror with such an expression of malice as his imposter now wore as he stood blocking the doorway. He suddenly understood the wood's name. TEUFELSSPIEGEL, the Devil's Mirror. The mimic cut Chris's scream short by chopping the side of its hand against his throat. Chris tripped over clothes he'd left on the floor the previous night. He caught himself, but the mimic had already leapt at him, knocking him to the floor with a heavy elbow to the back of his head. Chris crashed to the floor. Aurelio rose from the bed. Vision blurry, Chris opened his eyes. He tried to rise, but dizziness knocked him back down. Soon the dizziness began to fade, and as it cleared, so did his vision. He could see underneath the bed. There was someone there. A body, soaked in blood. It was Aurelio. The real Aurelio. Aurelio's mimic crouched next to Chris, who immediately tried rising to fight, but only made it to his knees. Aurelio's mimic held Russell's collar in his left hand. He shook it to make the tags ring their familiar jingle. It all came together at once. Chris realized he had been chasing after the real Russell. When Aurelio came home, the dog he saw running around the neighborhood was no dog at all. The mimic that followed Chris out of the woods stood over him now, staying out of Chris's sight. He saw Aurelio's mimic look up and meet the eyes of his own, and a sinister smile split its face all the way to the back of its jaw. Chris felt a pressure on his throat, felt hot blood pouring down his front. The dizziness returned twofold and quickly gave way to black. The sound of his own head thudding against the floor was the last sound Chris, the real Chris, ever heard. You made it out. Congratulations. If you enjoyed the story, please rate, like, review, or subscribe. For ad-free episodes and behind-the-scenes episodes I call Into the Woods, become a patron with the link in the description. You can also support the show by buying merch. That link is also in the description below. To stay up to date, follow me on Instagram and TikTok at The Warning Woods. And when you feel ready, meet me here for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.